If you lived before our time, who would you be? What if you could choose from 1,000 yesterdays, when the past was today and the new took your breath away? Who would you be? How would you live? Who would you love? Living every generation before us, remembering for generations to come. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
I'm Mike Rowe, and this is The Most. On this episode, demolition. The charges are set. The wires are rigged. There's no turning back now. Witness the destruction of the tallest building ever imploded. Oil, burning completely out of control. Thick smoke, intense flames. The maniacal maneuver that caused the worst oil fires in history. Nature run amok. One tornado's bad enough, but what about 15 touching down at the same time? The awesome destruction of the world's biggest tornado storm. Plus, our most moment, one of the most important moments in history. There's all that and much, much more coming up on The Most. Welcome to The Most, the show that takes history to the extreme. Now let's be honest, most of you out there would rather watch a building go down than go up, right? I mean, several years of slow-moving construction isn't nearly as exciting as a few quick minutes of massive demolition. And what could be more mesmerizing than the demolition of Hudson's department store, the tallest building ever imploded? She was the Grand Old Dam of Detroit. Built in 1911, the 23-story tall J.L. Hudson's was the tallest department store in the country, and for a time, the reigning queen of retail. But with the countrywide erosion of urban centers in the 1970s, Hudson's popularity began to wane, and by 1983, her doors could stay open no longer. There she sat, a massive, empty shell, until 1997. That year, hoping to clear the way for new developments, city officials voted to bring the giant down. In stepped James Santoro and his team of demolition experts at Controlled Demolition Incorporated.
J.L. Hudson's was an extremely large building, covering 2.2 million square feet. It was the tallest steel structure that had ever been taken down using explosives, 439 feet tall.
Santoro and his co-workers faced a hair-raising challenge. Bring the building down in one carefully choreographed implosion without reducing its delicate neighbors to rubble. In addition to the sheer size of the structure, the team had some unique hurdles to clear. The Hudson building had been constructed in 12 stages, each with varying degrees of strength. Simply put, some parts of the building would require more explosive than others. And since no original blueprints remained, every inch of the interior had to be examined and tested. Then, it was time for the firepower.
We placed explosives on over 9 levels of the structure. We had over 4,100 charges placed in 1,100 locations. We used approximately 2,700 pounds of explosives. It took us 24 days with 12 people doing nothing but loading explosives.
October 24th, 1998, the day of reckoning for the demolition crew. 36,000 feet of detonating cord was attached to a single ignition button. 10 square blocks were cordoned off. Then, at 5:47 p.m., the 87-year-old felt the first rumble of her demise. Save for a few broken windows and some minor debris damage, it was a demolition triumph. Never before had such an imposing structure been toppled.
Typically, when a building's about to come down, I don't even bother watching anymore. In the case of the J.L. Hudson building, I couldn't resist. I had to watch it. The building was just so big.
A ceremonious end for J.L. Hudson's, the tallest building ever imploded.
Though complex, the Hudson's implosion was a well-executed demolition. Not a hitch in the works, not a scratch to be found on anyone. But things don't always go so well. Witness the botched implosion of Australia's Royal Canberra Hospital, the worst demolition disaster.
July 13th, 1997, the Australian capital of Canberra was abuzz with anticipation. The Royal Canberra Hospital, long since closed and falling into disrepair, had been scheduled for a spectacular implosion. 12-year-old Katie Bender and her family were among the 100,000 spectators gathered on the shores of Lake Burley-Griffin.
They hadn't planned to go to the event. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision as they were driving home that day. They were urged to be there by the government and by the local media, which promoted the event.
1:20 p.m. From what was thought to be a safe distance, some 1,500 feet away, the crowd watched as the first blast of dynamite was detonated. As expected, the old hospital began to cave in on itself. But something was horribly wrong. Misplaced charges had turned the building into a bomb, its debris raining down on the onlookers.
The first thing people noticed was the sound whirring through the air, bits of metal, concrete, and a piece of steel weighing about 1 kilogram hit Katie Bender in the head, and she died instantly.
In total, shrapnel from the exploding building injured 8 people who were rushed to the hospital. Amazingly, in the wake of all that deadly, destructive force, all but one of the spectators escaped with their lives. All but Katie Bender. A criminal inquest has since condemned the demolition company for gross negligence, and the 2 men who oversaw the project have been charged with manslaughter. Perhaps a small comfort to the Bender family, who lost their daughter at the worst demolition disaster in history.
While nothing truly compares with the loss of life, the loss of magnificence can be devastating in its own right. The centuries have seen the destruction of many things, but perhaps nothing quite so extraordinary as New York's Pennsylvania Station, victim of the most regretted demolition.
It is a rare and wonderful thing. Clumsy, lifeless slabs of concrete and steel, glass and marble, willed by gifted hands into objects of indescribable beauty, impossible grandeur. In 1910, such a place was born. Pennsylvania Station, where rail passengers took their first glimpse of New York City's industrial glory. Designed by heralded architects McKim, Mead, and White, its massive columns and intricate sculptures skillfully evoked images of ancient Rome, a fitting gateway to a majestic city.
In its time, Pennsylvania Station was considered a great building. It was recognized as a monumental work, a real contribution to the city's landscape. But what's interesting about it is how relatively quickly it lost its grandeur.
Breathtaking architecture alone was not enough to repel the soot and dirt of a bustling metropolis. Soon, the pink granite walls of the crowded concourse began to lose their luster. And with air and auto transport stealing their business, Penn Station's owners were slipping into bankruptcy. In 1963, amidst considerable protest, they cut their losses, beginning the process of destroying what had been called the greatest work of architecture in the United States, all in order to build a more lucrative venture, Madison Square Garden.
Now we look back and we say, how was it possible that this society, this degraded society, could destroy such a great monument to architecture?
Barely half a century old, it was a landmark reduced to landfill. But even before the last truckload of rubble drove off, New Yorkers began to lament the passing of a piece of history. Soon, a movement was underway, one that would lead to some of the toughest local preservation laws in the country.
So that, in many ways, while we lost one of our great buildings, it did give great impetus to this modern historic preservation movement.
A casualty of modernization and profit-mindedness, all we have left resides in picture frames and memories. Penn Station, mighty gateway to a mighty city, and the most regretted demolition.
In 1999, New York City approved a $500 million plan to build a new Penn Station. The project is slated to be finished in the year 2005. Oil, black gold, Texas tea. It's the stuff that changed Jed Clampett's zip code to 90210, and it's inspired some of the greatest problem solving of the 20th century. How so? Well, take a gander at Hoover Diana Platform, the world's deepest oil production platform.
It used to be that all you needed to strike oil was a little luck and a lot of determination. But yesterday's oil men have yielded to high-tech global conglomerates, reaching deep into the earth, striving for new ways to sate our thirst for oil. The development of offshore drilling platforms was the industry's equivalent of a moon landing, tapping untold quantities of crude beneath the ocean floor. But none of these lonely labyrinthine giants reaches deeper than ExxonMobil's Hoover Diana platform in the Gulf of Mexico.
It is the drilling and production platform that is in the deepest water. It's in 4,800 feet of water. That's a depth of water that's essentially 4 Empire State Buildings standing on top of each other, or 9/10 of a mile.
Because the Hoover and Diana oil fields were so deep, a traditional standing platform was impossible. Instead, designers chose a unique floating approach called a deep draft caisson vessel. Beginning in 1988, a cylindrical base 83 stories high and half a football field in diameter was built and towed out to sea, where carefully controlled ballast sunk it to a predetermined depth. A separately built platform was then lifted in sections by a gigantic floating crane.
It is attached to the bottom by 12 anchors of cable and chain that are over 7,000 feet long into pilings that are pounded into the floor of the ocean.
Once the floating city was secured in the spring of 2000, its 50 round-the-clock inhabitants got down to drilling. Though the Hoover and Diana fields lie 15 miles apart, the $1.2 billion platform services both, using incredibly long drills to penetrate the ocean floor and harvest their abundance of oil and natural gas. By tapping into these rich oil fields, the Hoover Diana produces 100,000 barrels of oil a day, an impressive output for the deepest oil production platform in the world.
The combination of oil and water may make for dangerous work, but mix oil with the heat of a madman's anger, and it'll erupt into a firestorm of death and destruction. That's exactly what happened during the Persian Gulf War, igniting the worst oil fires in history.
February 1991. The 6-month Iraqi occupation of Kuwait is coming to an end. Saddam Hussein's makeshift army is crumbling in the face of the U.S.-led Operation Desert Storm. But as the retreating interlopers scurry home, they leave behind much more than the abandoned debris of war. Following Saddam Hussein's orders, the the Iraqi army sets off explosives rigged to Kuwait's oil wells. The result is a conflagration unlike any the world has ever seen.
It was an act of economic and environmental terrorism designed to destroy the ability of the Kuwaitis to function as a state and to produce oil and compete in the world that way.
Instantly, the Kuwaiti oil fields are transformed into a nightmarish tempest of flames. Expert teams are summoned to extinguish the so-called wild wells. A total of 656 oil wells are burning out of control. 74 others are leaking oil into the desert sands, forming vast lakes of toxic sludge.
Pollution is at its most dense out here. Very seldom see anything, certainly no living things, no birds, no insects, and no, everything else has been killed.
Braving 2,000-degree temperatures, the intrepid firefighters press headlong into the man-made inferno. They work day and night, all the while praying they will not succumb to the noxious fumes. Each day, 5 million barrels of oil are consumed, nearly 1/12 the world's daily output. Some scientists predict that it could take up to 5 years to extinguish these historic flames. The Kuwaiti government calls in even more firefighters. Eventually, 10,000 people from 40 different countries join in the perilous, back-breaking labor. Against the odds, this international entourage succeeds, quelling Iraq's flaming vengeance in only 9 months. Still, the disastrous fires cost the Kuwaiti government an estimated $30 billion in manpower and lost revenues, and more than 1 billion barrels of their oil reserves. An awesome toll of the worst oil fires in history.
The Kuwaiti people are still plagued by the aftermath of the oil fires, most horribly with abnormally high occurrences of asthma and cancer. Relief may be long in coming, but for America, some relief from the instability of the Middle East came in the late 1970s, thanks in great part to the Alaskan Pipeline, America's largest pipeline.
The Alaskan tundra, a desolate, inhospitable patch of earth fit for neither man nor beast. But America's ever-deepening reliance on oil has transformed this frozen landscape into the home of an engineering marvel. In the late 70s, the American oil industry spent $8 billion constructing the Alaskan Pipeline, pumping the abundant crude available in Prudhoe Bay to Valdez on the southern coast of the state. The 4-foot diameter pipe travels 800 miles, making it the country's largest pipeline. Construction faced a myriad of challenges. Bone-chilling temperatures, rough terrain, and even curious wildlife hampered the round-the-clock construction. Special equipment had to be built, including massive barges to carry pipe sections up the coastline. All told, 31 workers would lose their lives during the 38 months it took to complete the project. Then, on June 20th, 1977, anxious ears were pressed to the pipe as the first oil flowed. The 800-mile journey crossed 834 rivers and streams, 3 major mountain ranges, and into the port of Valdez, where 50 tankers would be filled each month and where the entire operation was monitored round the clock.
It has built into it thousands of sensors that are connected to the main control in Valdez that sense any change in the condition of the pipe, the flow rate, the pressure, and any spill the size of 1 teaspoon is reported.
At its peak, production topped 2 million barrels a day, roughly 20% of the nation's domestic output. But even after the oil began flowing, engineers had hurdles to clear. In order to provide maintenance along the 800 miles of pipe, an innovative device called a pig was developed that fit inside the pipeline itself. These pigs clean the interior walls and, just as importantly, report any irregularities or corrosion. Today, production has slowed to 1 million barrels a day. But since the 70s, over 12 billion barrels of oil have been transported by the Alaskan pipeline. Twisting and turning above ground and beneath, flowing through America's largest pipeline.
Ever wonder how fast oil flows? I have. In the Alaskan pipeline, oil flows at a speed of just over 5 miles an hour, and it takes the oil a little more than 6 days to make the 800-mile trip to the tankers in Valdez. Welcome back to The Most. I'm Mike Rowe. Now, we've all seen the movie. Big Bad Twister picks up angst-ridden teenage girl, drops her over the rainbow, where she learns there's no place like home. A happy ending to nature run amok. Well, here in the real world, you get caught in a twister, and you'll think you've been dropped right in the middle of hell. And it sure was hell on earth during the 1974 super outbreak, the world's biggest tornado storm.
On April 3rd, 1974, random forces of nature coalesced into evil. Freak weather conditions spawned a school of deadly twisters that rampaged across the southern and midwestern United States. The 16 hours of terror and fury would come to be known as the Super Outbreak, the biggest tornado storm in U.S. history.
There were 148 tornadoes involved in this less than 24-hour period, but if you were to take the path from each tornado, lay it end to end, that would have come out to about 2,500 miles worth of damage.
The recipe for disaster began brewing the night before, when moist air started moving north from the Gulf of Mexico. A low-pressure system east of the Rockies added cold, dry air into the mix. The final ingredient was a fast-moving jet stream racing from Texas to New England.
When you combine those things, it just spelled fireworks.
9:30 a.m. A tornado touched down in Boone County, Indiana. Soon, deadly twisters were wreaking havoc in 13 southern and Midwest states. The horror was made worse by tornadoes that ran the entire length of towns, indiscriminately crushing everything in sight.
Brick houses here completely gone. I don't know the people home enough.
Of the 148 tornadoes, 118 had paths more than a mile long. Victims tried to run, but with some tornadoes measuring 5 miles wide, there was no place to hide.
At one time, 15 on the ground at the same time, and some of these had bases 5 miles wide. I mean, something you just can't escape, a tornado with a base 5 miles wide.
On this day, no place was hit harder than the community of Xenia, Ohio. Violent tornadoes destroyed more than half the town, killing 34 people and causing property damage in excess of $100 million. By the time the skies had cleared, tornadoes had killed 330 people and injured 5,484. The total damage estimated was more than $600 million, making it the world's biggest tornado storm.
One good thing about tornadoes, at least you can see them coming. Not true with earthquakes. In fact, there's pretty much nothing in the world to warn us of the impending death and destruction of something like the 1960 Chilean earthquake, the most powerful earthquake of the 20th century.
May 22nd, 1960. As evening descends on the coast of Chile, its waters offer no hint of the demons stirring beneath. Earthquakes and aftershocks had ravaged the tiny South American country for the better part of the month. But the worst was yet to come. At 7:10, 100 miles from shore, all the Earth's power came to bear on one fault line.
The earthquake shook a length of the coast about 700 miles long and over a width of probably about 200 miles. That's getting up comparable to the area of the entire state of California. The ground shook in that area for about 5 minutes.
An eternity, considering that some quakes can level buildings in seconds. At a magnitude of 9.5 on the Richter scale, Chile shook with a savagery never before measured, a power that not only toppled structures, but moved the country itself.
During the period of that 5 minutes of shaking, the coastline actually was pushed to the west by about 70 feet.
By the time the rumbling subsided, 2,000 Chileans were dead, 3,000 injured, and over 2 million homeless. More than $500 million in property had been destroyed, and the streets were barely recognizable.
We estimate that the amount of energy that was released in that one earthquake was as much as all of the other earthquakes in the 20th century combined.
Foreign aid poured in to feed and mend a ravaged nation, but the quake had shaken it to pieces and shaken a people's faith in the ground beneath their feet. Still, they began digging out of the rubble and repairing the damage done by the most powerful earthquake in history.
If super outbreaks and giant tumblers seem beyond belief, imagine a storm raging 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pretty much forever. You're right, it's not like anything on Earth. It's off in outer space. I'm talking about Jupiter's red spot, the biggest storm in the galaxy.
Swirling clouds of poison gas, violent winds, intense gravitational forces. 400 million miles from the nearest umbrella, the biggest storm in our galaxy rages on Jupiter, the biggest planet in the solar system. The eye of this storm, a conspicuous red spot, a worthy crown for the namesake of the king of the gods. Space probes have proven that it's actually a raging area of low pressure. In other words, a massive storm.
Just why the big red spot is red, nobody really has any solid answers to that. This has got to be the biggest storm going on in the galaxy. How big? Compared to what happens on Earth, incredibly huge. In fact, within the big red spot, you could put 3 of our Earths.
Even more astounding than the storm's size is its stamina. The red spot is a weather system older than the United States, yet it shows no signs of slowing.
Well, our strongest hurricanes on Earth, Category 5, have winds in excess of 200 miles an hour. They're a rarity. This storm's been going on for 300 years with winds of 225 miles an hour on the perimeter of the storm.
The mechanics behind Jupiter's famous feature remain uncertain, but its future seems clear. The red spot will likely rage on through this century and the next, defending its heavyweight title of biggest storm in the galaxy.
Feeling washed up? Burned out? Are you putting in more hours than a bookie during Super Bowl and sleeping less than a chihuahua with fleas? Then, my friend, it's time for a little amusement. But what to do? Nowadays, there's plenty of options, but in the old days, nothing was more amusing than Coney Island, America's first great playground.
It was the original Sin City, a smoldering cauldron of prostitution, gambling, and undulating wild rides. Part P.T. Barnum, part Sodom by the sea, Coney Island was a stomping ground for low-life grifters and well-heeled suburbanites alike. It was America's first great playground. In 1884, Coney Island was transformed from a sleepy seaside town to a rollicking tourist attraction when entrepreneur LaMarcus Thompson opened America's first roller coaster. The curious came from miles around to witness Coney's gravity-defying switchback railway.
People could not quite imagine that this was possible, that people wouldn't just all fall out. But in fact, it worked.
It worked so well that Thompson was able to charge 5 cents per ride, pocketing a then mind-boggling $600 per day. With big money to be made, twisting, spinning rides were soon popping up all over Coney Island. By 1905, the park was drawing more than 200,000 people on the weekends. By 1915, weekend crowds had swelled to 600,000 and topped more than 1 million in 1920. In an era of frigid morality, Coney Island's titillating rides were the closest thing to the back seat of a car. Many rides were intentionally designed to cause dresses to flare up. Others practically forced couples into each other's arms. By the late 40s, couples were cuddling up at home in front of the tube, and Coney Island's popularity gradually began to fade. Today, Coney Island has been recast into a smaller amusement park, a distant memory of what was once America's first great playground.
Well, all that excitement's enough to make a person hungry. And if you're hungry in Coney Island, you gotta have a hot dog at Nathan's. Their top sales record, 55,000 dogs in one day. Now, of course, if your weary bones are craving some amusement that's a little more continental, then you might want to take a jaunt over to Denmark's Bakken, the world's oldest amusement park.
In 1583, there was little to do in Europe but wander the woods in search of miracle cures. Take the denizens of Denmark, who flocked to Bakken's forest that year for a dip in its supposedly enchanted springs. And of course, where there's a crowd, there's a buck to be made.
Well, it became an amusement park as people, early peddlers of food and other attractions and so on, went out to the park to sell things to the people who were just finding leisure out there on Sunday.
Year after year, the crowds returned, no longer for the healing waters, but for the ever-abundant entertainment. Though the term amusement park had yet to enter the cultural lexicon, Bakken became just that, growing in attendance and attractions over the centuries. There were clowns, parades, games, and rides, though some fit that definition better than others. To the world-weary, Bakken offered a refuge, a place where cowboys danced and children drove cars, all as 100 Kris Kringles strolled by.
Over a very long period of time, over 400 years now, it has kind of captured the imagination of the Danish people. They're very proud of the park. They go there in great numbers. It's been very successful, and I think it becomes a matter of kind of feeding on its own legend.
As the park looks ahead to its 500th birthday, it shows no signs of slowing. With 32 rides, 160 stores, 35 restaurants, and a capacity for 6,000 guests, Bakken is not only on par with its rivals, but also the world's oldest amusement park.
So you're starting to unwind, feeling a little less stressed, but you're not quite ready to head back to the salt mines. Well then, how about kicking back with a cold beer at Fenway Park? the oldest baseball stadium.
They come to worship. From April to October, Bostonians of every race and religion make their pilgrimage to the Emerald Temple, Fenway Park. Nestled in the shadow of the historic Back Bay, neither overwhelming nor ostentatious, it is merely a ballpark, one with remarkable allure.
When people walk into Fenway Park for the very first time, most of them come up through the ramps and they see the green grass and they see the green wall of left field that appears to be so close that they can reach out and touch it. And it's so cozy because everything is close to the playing field. It's been passed down through generations, from grandfathers to fathers to children.
Its grandstands are home to millions of ghosts, echoes of the cheering crowds that have filled the seats since April 20th, 1912. But Fenway's debut made few headlines, as newspapers were instead filled with reports of the sinking 5 days earlier of the Titanic. Some would say the Red Sox were equally cursed, from the infamous sale of Babe Ruth in 1919 to the string of lackluster seasons that followed. Win or lose, the faithful cheered on while a parade of history marched through the bluegrass. It saw FDR's final campaign speech in 1944, Ted Williams' 502-foot home run in 1946, and the first playoff game in American League history in 1948. Like the world around it, the ballpark changed through the years. In 1947, billboards on the towering left field wall were painted over, and the infamous Green Monster was born. Also that year, giant arc lights cut through the night, and fans thrilled to their first game after sundown. Message boards, luxury boxes, and giant video screens followed over the decades. And with the 1999 closing and demolition of Detroit's Tiger Stadium, Fenway entered the history books as the oldest operating baseball stadium. But with under 34,000 seats, today's Fenway has the lowest capacity in the majors, sparking debates over the need for a new venue. Unthinkable to many of the fans that continue their seasonal pilgrimage to Fenway Park, the oldest baseball stadium.
And now it's time for our Most Moments, an event that forever altered the course of race relations in America. As our image reveals itself, the 1957 school year is about to begin, and an angry mob is trying to stop 9 black students from entering Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas.
The question I usually get asked is, were we scared? I think initially we didn't anticipate clearly all of the violence and turmoil that occurred. The first day that we attempted to go to school, 8 of us were at one part of the school and Elizabeth Eckford was at another part, and it was the mob that followed Elizabeth. Then you begin to feel that this was a very hostile, violent group of people. Even at that point, I told myself that if we didn't go through with it, didn't attend Central and backed out, it would just reinforce the view that the African American community in Little Rock wasn't interested in making a change in things.
During the 1950s, African Americans throughout the country were trying to make their voices heard.
We, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, do now and will continue to carry on our mass protest.
The driver demanded that I give this seat up for a white man. I didn't feel that I was being treated as a human being. I refused to give up this seat. I said no.
Little Rock was a year after the Montgomery bus boycott. So we had seen the impact of Rosa Parks and the beginning of Dr. King's career, and knew that things could change.
All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet.
The first step for the Little Rock Nine came in May 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court issued its opinion in the landmark case Brown versus the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. Separate but equal was inherently unequal, and integration was now the law of the land. In 1957, this decision and the power of the federal government were tested in Little Rock, Arkansas.
We didn't, at the moment we were selected, have any idea it was going to be as difficult as it turned out to be.
In the face of protest at Central High School, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, calls out the National Guard. His official reasoning is to preserve the peace and prevent violence.
It clearly wasn't to protect us. It was to make a symbolic stand. It was to protect the way of life in the South, because they barred our entrance.
Hoping to throw open these school doors, President Dwight Eisenhower does the unprecedented. He calls in the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army.
I think President Eisenhower wanted to show that the federal government was supreme in this. And they could have done what they needed to do with 100 troops. But 1,000 paratroopers was really meant to send a message.
Under the guard of the U.S. Army, the students are finally able to do something seemingly very simple: go to school. But it would not be easy for Ernest Green or his 8 fellow black students.
School was like going to war every day. The walks from class to class were where, you had a lot of harassment, a lot of physical violence.
But Ernest Green persevered, becoming the first black graduate of Central High School with the class of 1958. Green would eventually go on to a successful banking career and government service in the Carter administration. But in 1958, integration was not complete in Little Rock. The following year, Governor Faubus closed all public schools in Arkansas instead of complying with desegregation. Schools in Arkansas would not be fully integrated until 1972. Yet, the world would always remember these 9 students who, by claiming their place in the classroom, were claiming their place in history.
Attending Central was special in the sense that it was part of history. It was part of a change. This was reverberating all over the country, all over the world.
Ernest Green wasn't the only member of the Little Rock Nine to make a name for himself. What happened to the rest? Well, one's a magazine publisher, another a social worker. There's also a teacher, a realtor, 2 writers, an accountant, and a clinical psychologist. Seems they did pretty well, all things being equal.